Hello and welcome to this video on protectionism. So in this video we're going to look at the reasons for protectionism and then the different ways in which a government might be able to introduce protectionist measures. So let's start off with what protectionism means. A government is said to be protectionist or pursuing a protectionist agenda if it's implementing measures designed to restrict free trade. So the opposite of trade liberalisation. The government might do this by creating barriers to prevent or reduce the level of imports. So why would a government want to restrict free trade? Why would a government want to reduce the level of imports? Well, we have 7 reasons here with clever picture clues. You might want to pause the video for a second and see if you can guess the reason from the clue. Well, let's see if you guessed correctly. Image A was meant to represent the desire to protect geriatric, and by geriatric we mean old, well-established industries. For example, in America, like the car industry, we might want to protect jobs in that industry, protect that industry and those businesses. So we want to restrict the level of imported foreign cars. Or we might also want to protect infant industries, new industries that are growing. Perhaps there is a new renewable energy technology that's growing in our country. It can't yet compete internationally on price, but we want to support it. We don't want people to be buying imported technology. We want people to support our domestic technology so it grows into a larger business. The second one was to protect employment. This seems fairly straightforward. If we're importing, we're not buying from the domestic market. So domestic workers are going to lose jobs. But if we restrict imports, we can protect employment. The third one is we may wish to correct the balance of payments deficit on the current account. If we restrict the level of imports, then we will achieve this. Number 4 is that we may want to restrict imports from countries that have poor health and safety records, or perhaps countries where we have environmental issues about how the production has taken place. E was for strategic reasons. Do we really want to be importing all of our food from another country? What happens if for some particular reason they decide not to develop those? We're very reliant on that country. So there may be strategic reasons that in key industries we don't want to be reliant on imports. The government may wish to put taxes on imports in order to generate tax revenue. Also, if domestic businesses are have customers, they will generate corporation tax for the government. And finally, we may do it in retaliation. If one country or one government has restricted imports from our country, well, we're going to restrict their goods coming into our country. Another reason for protectionism is to prevent dumping, and you might see that I haven't put a picture clue in for this one. Dumping occurs when a country exports kind of spare capacity or exports excess supply produced in its economy to another economy. And it does this at below the average cost of production. Maybe it has had a very good harvest or has excess capacity in a particular industry. And so, those goods have no real value to them. We just want to get any sort of marginal revenue that we can. And so we're going to sell them at whatever price we can abroad. So we export the goods at below the average cost of production. So it's kind of like a form of predatory pricing that's coming into our market. And we might want to prevent that because it's going to make our domestic companies suffer. And we can justify this by saying that it unfairly distorts comparative advantage. An example might be China's steel industry, which has significant excess of capacity. And then China has been accused of dumping all this excess steel on the European market at very low prices, selling them for less than the cost of production in order to recoup variable costs rather than fixed costs. And this makes it harder for EU steel producers to compete. So what can a government do if it wants to restrict imports? Well, we're going to look at 4 main tactics that the government can use. The first one is tariffs. A tariff is a tax or a duty that raises the price of imported products. sometimes referred to as customs duties. Here are some examples. The pros and the cons. Well, the advantage is it reduces imports. A key one for government, it provides tax revenue. And products are still available for those that really want them and can pay. On the flip side, it does depend on the price elasticity of demand for imports. Just because we make them more expensive, if they're price inelastic, it won't necessarily reduce demand. Consumers have to face higher prices, and so we're reducing consumer surplus. And ultimately, we're protecting companies that are less efficient. So a bit more information here on tariffs. A final point there in the last sentence, a tariff can also improve a nation's trade balance. Tariffs can generate tax revenue for governments. We've mentioned that. Indeed, for many developing countries, import tariffs are an important source of tax revenues because perhaps they don't have the domestic businesses to generate sort of significant corporation tax. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is a quota. A quota is a physical limit on the level of imports allowed into a country, or it could be a limit on the value of imports allowed into a country in a particular time period. Again, here is an example. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this? Well, again, it reduces imports. It doesn't raise the price for the consumer, so that's an advantage. On the flip side, the negatives are it limits choice for the consumer and does encourage the black market and smuggling. Again, here's some more information about quotas. So quotas obviously limit the amount of imports and direct consumers to buy domestic goods instead. They also do create excess demand for imports for a given level of domestic demand, which can drive up the market price of those imported goods. And the higher market price can benefit domestic producers if they sell similar type of good. Our next one is subsidies. A subsidy is a payment from the government to encourage domestic production by lowering costs for producers in that country. Here's another example, and here are some pros and cons. The advantage here is that it reduces prices for consumers, so increases consumer surplus, and raises the chance of exports for domestic producers as their prices become more competitive. The cons, well, the big one is the opportunity cost. This also needs to be funded somehow, perhaps through higher taxes or government debt. And again, it's really helping out less efficient producers gain an advantage, so it's distorting comparative advantage. Again, some more information on subsidies here. A subsidy is a form of non-tariff barrier. We might always evaluate it by talking about it depends on the size of the subsidy. Finally, we have government regulations or government legislation. Countries might employ measures such as legal forms, health and safety inspections, and specific product specifications in order to reduce the level of imports. This might take a variety of forms like labelling, health and safety regulations, the product must meet certain environmental standards, must come from a certain country. These will discourage imports by raising the costs of selling those imported goods in our market. Some advantages, well, this might improve quality of the goods that are imported. It might reduce the negative effects on the environment or the negative treatment of workers that may be involved in the production of these imports, particularly if they're cheaper. On the flip side, they raise costs. Loopholes can be found, shortcuts can be found in getting around these regulations, and it's difficult to enforce these and check for every single imported good that the regulations have been met. Here are some examples of areas where the government might legislate things that maybe breach intellectual property law. So what are the arguments against protectionism? Well, if we place tariffs or subsidize our domestic companies, then another government might decide to do the same thing. And so it's no real win, it's a lose-lose. We're distorting the market. The prices of these products no longer reflect the cost of making them. They no longer act as an incentive or a signal. We lose a lot of the market mechanisms' key features because the prices are being distorted. Often consumers have to pay higher prices, particularly if we've used a tariff or regulations or a quota. There may be higher costs for exporters as a result, particularly if we place a tariff on imported raw material. Some may try and bypass import controls, so we've got to always question how effective will these controls be. And tariffs are considered to be very regressive. If I increase the price of imported clothing, it's the poorest in society who pay the biggest share as a proportion of their income. An extra $10 to someone on a low income seems a lot more of their salary than the extra $10 to a multimillionaire. So in this video, we've looked at the reasons for protectionism and looked at some of the pros and cons of the different types of protectionist measure a government might take. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.